What's up everyone, my name is MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick review of Sony's new AS50 action camera. Now this camera brings a lot of new features to the table even though it's supposed to be one of their more budget and entry level cameras. Now we're going to cover a lot of features. You can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in, otherwise sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a bit. Now we're going to start off by taking a look at the contents of these boxes. Now we have the AS50R model, which includes the LRV3 Live View remote. That box retails for $349. There is one without the remote that retails for $199, and it's just labeled the AS50 box. Now in the box we'll find the AS50 in the dive housing with the flat lens case, which can dive up to 197 feet or 60 meters, one of the legacy batteries, the LRV3 Live View remote, what's called the belt, a cradle for the LRV3 remote, which is how we'll actually charge it, a mount adapter for the remote, a micro USB cable, and a bunch of sort of legacy newspaper manuals that are actually kind of sparse on information this time around. Now the first thing you'll notice about the AS50 is the new dive housing. A lot of time and energy and work went into making this case look really nice and really usable. Right off the bat you'll notice it has a flat lens this time around, which will give us crystal clear results underwater, making this case no longer just a sort of all-around protection case but an actual usable diving case. And speaking of diving, it can go up to 197 feet underwater or up to 60 meters. And the flat lens itself isn't nearly as big as the aftermarket one that was supplied for the AS200, so even if we are using these things for like motocross or snowboarding and it's on the side of your helmet, the flat lens will not be nearly as big, so it won't pick up as much dirt or sort of water and obstruct your view. Now the case itself has nice big buttons with a lot of surface area. Now this might not seem like a big deal, but when you're messing with that camera and you have gloves on, having bigger buttons makes the whole experience much better. On the top now we have our record button as opposed to on the back in the AS200 model. The camera is very similar now to the X1000V or AZ1. So we have our record button and our hold button, but we also have a dedicated powering on and off button. Now on the right side of the camera we have a dedicated menu button, which will make it really fast for us to switch between modes and change different settings. We also have two navigation buttons, which will also double how we'll sort of zoom in and zoom out when in magnification mode, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And when we open up the case, you can just see there's some really nice seals, and again, a lot of time and energy went into making the dive housing for the AS50 look really nice. And that might be because the AS50 itself does feel a little cheaper, especially when compared to cameras previously that came out before it. Gone are our nice sort of rubber seals and our sort of really nice doors that just sort of click into place. Instead, now we have these very loose, very snappy doors. They're almost kind of flimsy. The body design itself is similar to a big AZ1. It's actually on par with the AS200 in terms of camera size, but the body layout actually lends itself closer to looking like an AZ1 clone, just slightly bigger. The material itself is very similar to the AS15 and AS30, and if you're not familiar with those cameras, it just felt like a very plasticky camera. We've gone back to the black design, and overall it just feels like a much cheaper camera. The battery door on the left side of the camera, for example, we pop this open to sort of reveal the battery, but then the battery case itself feels kind of flimsy, and then when we want to push that door closed, we actually run the risk of, as we sort of try and snap it in, of sort of rubbing our fingers against the lens, which would just put grease on it and be no good for you. But underneath that door, you'll find your Wi-Fi name and Wi-Fi password. It's automatically in there. It's not hidden somewhere in the sort of manuals this time around. We have a sort of micro USB door on the back with nothing really else. And on the bottom of this camera, we're going to have a built-in tripod mount that's not quite in the center, but not too far off that it's going to cause us any problems. However, we do have the micro SD card slot here, and this might actually cause you quite a bit of headache if you're not aware of what type of micro SD card to get. Now this camera does shoot at a data rate of 50 megabits a second. Now that requires an XC formatted card. And what is an XC formatted card? If you're not familiar, there are basically two different formats of micro SD card. HC is generally reserved for cheaper cards, such as 32 gigabyte cards. If you move up to 64 and 128 gigabyte cards, which this camera supports, chances are you're picking up an XC formatted card, but definitely check your packaging. When you have an XC formatted card, it allows the camera to switch into XAVCS mode. Now this will be referred to as the HD menu, but when you go into there, it will actually say it. If you do have an HC card, it actually will let you select this option, but when you're cycling through the menu, it will actually give you an error and it will automatically switch to MP4 recording mode, which is a little bit softer and not as crisp. So if you want the best quality, make sure you're picking up an XC formatted card. And if you guys need some help with recommendations, there's a few that we recommend in the more information section below this video. Now when you pair this camera on for the first time, you're going to notice one big change. It has a new jingle, and all of the audio notifications within the camera have actually been very much boosted. And I think that's in criticism with a lot of the complaints that you really couldn't hear the audio notifications when filming in the dive housing in the past. They've also added an additional recording LED at the front of the camera where the stereo microphones is usually located. And inside the camera, we're actually going to find the same CMOS and image processor that we have on cameras such as the AS200, the higher end model, with the only big difference is it doesn't have the same exact ultra-wide lens that the AS200 has. Instead, it has just a standard Zeiss tester lens. So the AS50 is probably the fastest and most user-friendly action camera Sony's put out, thanks mainly to a redesigned UI system. Now, it's not the most perfect UI system, but I really enjoy it because it's fast, snappy, and for the most part user-friendly. We have a 6-grid system that we can just sort of hop into by pressing the menu button, and we can scroll through it really fast, or we can just tap through it to go even faster. There's no hang-ups. When I make changes to settings, I don't get booted out back to the main menu. It just sort of keeps me within that sub-setting menu, which was a big problem when you wanted to change 3 or 4 settings at one time. You'd have to do way more button presses than you really should have had to, and they took a lot of that to heart, and they've changed a lot of this. There's a lot of smart options in here, and it's really fast to go through. The only thing, again, is it's just really hard to see when you don't have proper amount of light, because it's like a watch LCD screen. I would have really liked something that was a little backlit or something just so I can see it at night. And while not everybody will have it, the LVR3 Live View remote will solve a lot of those low light menu option issues. Now in the past I was never really a fan of the LVR2 remote or the One remote. I just found them very clunky, they hurt to be on my wrist, and they were just slow, and they didn't allow me to change any of the settings I wanted to. They were very limiting. The LVR3 though is super fast, the battery lasts quite a bit of time. We took it out for 2 8-hour days and I never had to charge it once. It does a really good power save mode while still staying connected to the camera. It's got some really nice new smart options. We can actually power on the camera and automatically turn on the camera as well as the remote at the same time. And then if you want to turn the camera off, you can actually turn just the wrist remote off and it will turn the camera off. This is a big change from the last remote, which only let you do half of the on-off procedure. So once it was in off mode, you could never really power it back on. Now the one issue I discovered is if you accidentally turn the watch on and then quickly turn it off, it will lose its sync with the camera and you'll have to manually turn the camera on. But it's just something if you're in a vehicle and you don't really have access to the LRV3 remote to keep in mind. But actually, for once, I think I actually might keep this remote around, and actually it's very useful, and again, it's a really quick way to change the settings, and just being able to turn the camera on and off from far away is a really nice option. Now when it comes to filming with the AS50, you have 2 major formats in terms of video quality that you can decide between, and that's filming with the HD mode, which is also referred to as the XAVC-S mode. This is what's going to give us the ability to have the best picture and film with the full 50 megabit per second data rate. Now the only way you can use this again is with an XC formatted card, but when you are in this mode, you have the ability to do 1080p 60 frames a second, which will give you really super smooth recording, 1080p 30 frames a second, which is traditionally what most people record at, and 1080p 24 frames a second, which is a more cinematic feel. Now if you're from the UK region or outside the US, you can actually switch it over to 25 frames per second by messing with some of the settings in terms of region. Now, if for some reason you can't enable XAVC-S mode, maybe you're restricted to an HC card, you'll have to film in MP4 mode. Now, when you are filming in MP4 mode, you're only getting 28 megabits a second, so your quality is going to be a little softer and a little more downgraded, but one of the benefits is, since we can write to the card faster now, we can get higher frames per second. So we can take 720p and film at 120 frames per second. Now, if you're doing a traditional edit at 30 frames a second, 120 frames per second footage can be slowed down to 25% or 4 times as slow as traditional footage, and it's super smooth playback. There's no interlacing of frames, there's no trickery or magic. Just within action camera software or any editing software, you can switch that back to playback at 30 frames per second and it'll be super smooth. Now as 60 frames per second edits become more and more popular because players like YouTube and Vimeo support those natively on playback, something like 120 frames per second will allow you to do 50% slowdown or ×2 slowdown in your editor. And while the quality might not be on par with what you're filming at 1080p 60 frames per second, it really won't make a noticeable difference to your audience to film in this mode and the results that you get look spectacular. Just having gorgeous flips or aerials or just having little particles and details fly without the interlacing looks really cool. Now the overall quality of the AS50 is a little bit soft, especially when compared to cameras such as the AS200 or X1000V. And if I had to compare this to any other Sony action cameras, it's very much on par with the AZ1. It's almost nearly identical, minus the minor lens changes. The AS50 isn't using the ultra-wide lens that is on all other Sony action cameras. Now, it's still going to have a large amount of lens distortion as you get further away from the center of the lens, and you can see that here as we're sort of moving the camera left and right. Take a look at the edge of the screens and just notice how things sort of warp or bend or stretch as they get closer to the edge. Now with the AS50, we don't see that nearly as much, but it still is there. It's only reduced just a little bit, and thanks to things like field of view controls or steady shot, we can actually reduce this just a little bit. By cropping on the image sensor a little bit, we can actually reduce how much of the lens distortion we see. However, if you are filming in wide field of view mode, there is a lot of different lens correction software that we can use in post to get rid of some of this later on. And again, the overall quality of the AS200V, it has a really great color profile. My only complaint really is that the image is a little bit soft, but not soft enough that it really isn't unexpected for the $200 price range. In fact, for the $200 price range, it is spot on. It actually a little bit far exceeds where I'd expect it to land. It's pretty much identical, like I said, to the AZ1. It's a really nice image, really good overall balance. It's handling contrast well. We have it pointed at snow with bright lights, and it's able to sort of really balance the colors of my jacket really well and bounce around with the bright snow in the background without strobing or flickering. Again, it's just a little soft, but it wouldn't really be something, it just overall looks great, especially when you put it together in an edit. It's not going to take you away. The quality is definitely in the upper range in what I expect for action cameras, especially when you consider this camera starts at $199. And one of the areas that's really hard for action cameras to film is low light scenarios, and that's because we have such a small CMOS sensor, we don't have a ton of time for light to collect on the card. Now the Sony line of cameras have a backlit image sensor, and this one is really good with filming in indoor quality even without natural light provided. It's similar again to what we've come to expect from the Sony line of action cameras, but it is really nice to point out that compared to most other action cameras, you really do need natural light in order to film indoors, which makes filming things like weddings almost nearly impossible as you get into the evening. The Sony doesn't really get far past that point, but it does give you a little more wiggle room, especially if you're filming at 1080p 30 frames a second. Now in terms of color profile, the camera's going to ship with what you've come to expect. It's vivid color mode. It's got a really nice pop, really saturated colors. It really crunches the blacks and the whites into a really nice balance. It makes an overall appealing image without any sort of post-production work needed. Now if you want to do post-production color correction, you totally have the option by switching the camera into its flat mode. What that's going to do is it's basically if you consider all of your white and black values in a deck of cards, vivid mode will give you about 30 cards, while flat mode will give you all 32. Now your image is going to appear to be a little bit washed out, but if you're fiddling with your curves and post color correction, this is going to give you a lot more range to mess around with. And one of the biggest selling points with the Sony line of action cameras is its built-in digital stabilizer. A steady shot is going to allow us to reduce the amount of vibration that we see in the footage and help us basically save a bunch of shots that would be otherwise really hard to salvage or rewatch later on. We're basically going to remove around 60 to 70% of our basically minor hand movements and jitters and stuff like that, but it's not going to remove like big bumps, and in the process it is going to give us a more narrow field of view. This is because all of the footage that's off screen is sort of being warped and moved around just to ensure the camera stays steady in the center. So you will notice a little bit of warping in the edges, but you can see here as we're snowboarding, take a look at those edges, or as we're just sort of standing around with steady shot enabled, and you can kind of see this. It doesn't deter from the footage that's happening in the center, but it is going to cause some sort of warpiness in the edges. If you try and double stack this with YouTube stabilization, it's not going to be good results. But overall, it's a really nice addition to their budget line of action cameras. Now in the past, if we wanted to crop in on the image sensor, we were limited to just enabling the camera with steady shot. And unfortunately, when we had the camera locked off and we had steady shot turned on, it could lead to some issues. But now we have the ability to change our field of view options within the camera, and this has been a huge deal for me. This is something I've been arguing about for a while. So now we have the ability to switch over to narrow view, which is a 120-degree field of view, and it'll lock that in. But on top of that, we also have the ability to do a sort of variable zoom or a magnification mode that'll allow us to do a digital zoom on top of the narrow or on the wide. So let's say we had a shot where we wanted to sort of crop out the sort of dirt that's on the snow. We can basically zoom in and get rid of that, or if we wanted to basically zoom into a mountain a little bit, or if we're sort of on a tennis court or a side of a court and we want to not have the whole stadium, I want to focus in on my form or my moves, this digital zoom allows us to just zoom in a little bit. However, it is just a digital zoom. It's the equivalent of taking your footage later and scaling it up. But if that's something you want to avoid doing later to 13, 14, 15 shots, you can do it all with the wrist remote and you're good to go. And one of the other smart options that Sony has included in their camera is the ability to choose different scenes. Now, let's say you're filming underwater. Generally, there's a lot more blue in your environment because you're underwater. Now, what you can do with changing your scene is switch to underwater mode, and this will introduce a few more red pixels into your video, which basically balances out the picture. Now, we don't really have a great example of it here, but there are plenty on Sony's websites and other side-by-side comparisons we've done with Sony in the past, but basically you just get a more balanced out image without having to put a red filter, and it generally is a little bit safer than a red filter because it's nowhere near as extreme. So if you're looking to go underwater and you definitely want to balance that out just a little bit, but you're afraid of a red filter just flooding your camera with too much red, enabling your underwater scene basically is a guaranteed better shot. And one of the common problems you run into when you're filming outdoors is generally wind noise. Now, whether you're filming on a car and you have the camera fronted out, or you're just sort of talking and wind is blowing, you do have the option to enable a wind reduction in the AS50. Now, the camera does feature a built-in stereo microphone. It didn't really have the pizzazz and wow that I got out of the X1000V or AS200, but it's still far within more than acceptable ranges. It does have a good dynamic range. It's not as crisp and sharp as I may want, but again, it's not something that I was really expecting from the AS50. Now, another one of the big areas that received an upgrade with the AS50 is its photo section. Now, we do have an 11.9 megapixel image sensor, which is on par again with the AZ1. However, this time we have two different options when we're taking photos for the main part. We have our single raw photos, which is just the button press and we get one photo. That will take photos at a resolution of 4608 by 2592. Now, this time around, time-lapse has more options. We can actually take a photo at what is called a 4K resolution. Now, in the past, the time-lapse photos were basically just really low-quality movie stills that were then compiled into a time-lapse or given to us as really low-quality JPEGs for us to edit around with. However, this time around, I'm really happy to report that these are much higher in quality. In fact, the resolution is 3840 by 2160, and in terms of size and quality, the time-lapse photos are a little bit less in quality, but nowhere near to the amount that we were seeing in the past. What I can do now is I can actually set the camera up to time-lapse, and when we're doing runs down the mountain, I can get a bunch of great selfies, stop the camera, and I can actually edit those colors later on in post. They're not crunched down, they're not low quality. Again, it's not the same quality that we're going to get out of a full photo, but it definitely is very close. And again, when I put these side by side and put the split down the middle, you really have to look at those grains of sand at the bottom to really see where we go from just being on the full res photo to the time-lapse photo. So it's a welcome addition. And with the time-lapse now, we have a bunch of different options. If we want to actually limit how many photos we take in a time-lapse, we can do it in a series of 300. And what I mean by that is that you can do 300 photos in a time-lapse, 600, 900, and then the camera will automatically shut off to save you power. So if you don't want to take a time-lapse of the entire night, but you wanted to get 300 here, 600 there, you can do that, and they'll all come back in individual photos for you to edit later on. And if you are in the traditional photo mode where you press the button and you take one photo, there's actually a few different modes and options that we can play around with here. We have burst feature, which will take a series of photos over time, but one of the bigger exciting things is something called Motion Shot LE. Now, this was patched into the AS200, but basically what it does is it takes a series of photos in a second, and then it composites all of those photos on top of one another to create a sort of image sequence. So if you're going off a jump, or if you're doing something really fast, it will basically take all of the areas that were the same in the photo, and it will basically erase those and then take all the areas that have changed and put them on top. And what that creates is this really awesome image sequence of a sort of jump or a stunt you've done, but it's all built in the camera. Now, it's not perfect. Some of the edges are going to have this blue outline, and none of the photos are saved individually, so you can't go back later and try and replicate this yourself. But if you wanted to do that, I would suggest switching to burst mode and then building it up yourself in whatever software you have later. There are a lot of things out there that'll do it for you, but it's really awesome that it does it in camera with little to no effort. On top of that, you also have loop recording and live streaming. Now, the live streaming is through Ustream. I'm pretty sure we could hack it in a way so it works with other options, and loop recording, if you don't know, is a really good feature if you're doing things like a dash cam with this, or if you wanted to record something and never miss a shot. Allows basically the camera to keep recording until the card fills up, and then it starts deleting the oldest clips. Now, we did some short battery tests in the time we had with the AS50, and we had some really interesting results. We actually paired it up with the LRV3 remote at the time. Since I do plan on using it a lot, I was really interested to see what our battery life would be at. Now, with this setup, I expected the battery to die relatively quick because we're draining Wi-Fi, we're filming, and the card actually filled up before the battery ended up draining, and the camera stayed on for an additional few minutes before I realized what was happening, dumped the card, and then put the card back into the camera and then set up the whole thing to record again. And during this whole in-between time, it's still connected to the remote. And then we set up the test one more time to do 1080p at 60 frames a second, and this time got results that I was a little more expecting, but still a really long time for 1080p 60 frames a second while connected to the Wi-Fi remote the entire time. But we're going to go into more details about the battery life with the AS50 in a separate video. So if you're thinking about picking up some accessories with the AS50, we've really liked the LRV3 remote. However, it is 3/4 the cost of the camera itself. But if you can swing it, it definitely is one of the better upgrades in remotes that we've used. I really like it mainly because it's just super fast and snappy, and has a lot of good options that we could switch through. There's also, again, a good micro SD card. We use the SanDisk Extreme Pro line. That's a sort of black and red card, so you can find the links to that in the more information section below. But one of the other items that we've been using, and one of the new ones to the market, is Sony's shooting grip. This is also known as the VCT-STG1, and basically it's a handheld mount that sort of transforms into a tripod mount. Now, again, it is a little bit on the costly side. It is $49.99. I really wish it was closer somewhere to that $30 mark, but if you're looking to buy one accessory and just have something to have fun with the camera, it does add a lot of versatility and usability. It's really nice and compact and durable. I do wish it had some like slightly grippy material on that handle, but it's nothing that really deterred from my experience. It was just really nice to put up a shot real quick, put it down on a tripod on a trail, get that, collapse it back into a handheld mount, and then start doing some snowboarding stuff. And with the added 4K sort of time-lapse mode when we're going down the mountain, just having that sort of handheld mount, we're able to get some really good selfies or group photos, and we could just throw it in our pocket. It's just really convenient. So those are the accessories I would kind of recommend when looking at the AS50. So overall, the Sony AS50 is a really cool and sort of interesting indication on where Sony's taking their action cameras and how it's listening to the community and building upon that. Having the new dive housing that has a flat lens built in without a ton of surface area, the bigger buttons, is a huge improvement, and the quality of the case itself is really nice. The body itself is a little bit lower in quality, but it doesn't really deter from what the camera can do outside of it no longer being splash proof without the case, or dust proof or anything like that. The case itself does feel a little more flimsy, which is a kind of a bummer, but some of the smarter changes on the inside get me more excited for what Sony has in line down the future. Now, the camera is very much on par with an upgraded AZ1. In terms of image quality, it's pretty much on par with that, but the real big things come from the new features added, such as the new UI, which is really easy to navigate. It's quick, it's smart, it's really well laid out. Some of the new features, including 4K time-lapse. Now our time-lapse photos are much higher quality and very similar to being on par with full-res photos. The full-res photos having the motion shot and burst modes is really nice. We could do live streaming, but external microphone and GPS support seems to be missing. This camera is just packed with a ton of features. We can do 1080p at 60 frames a second or 720p at 120 frames per second with a 50 megabit data connection. Now, the images are going to be a little bit softer than something like the AS200V or the X1000V, but it's very much on par. Actually, it's a little bit better with the AZ1 in terms of quality and sharpness, but very marginally. And we are reducing some of the lens distortion that we did see with the ultra wide series on the 1000V and AS200. It's not greatly reduced, but it's enough that it's we can sort of get a little bit excited about it. And we also get field of view options now. This time around we can switch to narrow. We have a magnification mode, so if we want to zoom in from far away, we just have a lot of different options as a filmmaker to sort of set up our shot this time around. Overall, I'll say the Sony AS50 isn't going to go down as Sony's most exciting action camera, but in the moment right now, it is a really cool direction that Sony is going with. Listening to the community feedback and building upon that, it's going to be really exciting to see where Sony goes from here, but it's a great start to their budget line of action cameras. And now that you've heard what I've had to say about the AS50, we've actually built a tool that allows the community to throw in their input as well. So if you follow the link in the more information section below, you'll be able to see the community's review of the AS50, which lists all the pros and cons everybody's had and actually allows them to give a 5-star scale. So you can basically see my score, the community score, and this is a really good tool to send to Sony. That way they can get feedback on what the community is liking and what the community is not liking. Be sure to check out the comments as well as the camera evolves out over time. Some of these things what we've listed might change. And if you found this video useful, please share it. It's one of the biggest helps in getting people sort of exposed to MarkHawkCam because I put a lot of my own money and time and energy into this site. Speaking of which, if you found this video super useful, use one of the Amazon links. All of that money goes back into MarkHawkCam to help buy new cameras. And if you're feeling super generous, that Patreon link is a way you can support YouTubers such as myself make a living. But yeah, check out the more information section below for a bunch of other stuff. And I'm MarkHawk, and I'll see you all out there. Have a good one, everyone.